Yeah.
Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. Welcome back. It is exactly 18 after 9 o'clock. This is News and Views right here on Salam Media. Now, on Friday, the United Nations Human Rights Council adopted a resolution to establish an international commission of human rights experts to investigate allegations of abuses committed by all warring parties in northern Ethiopia's Tigray conflict. Let's talk to an international human rights lawyer to unpack this issue for us. Who's going to hold whom responsible, and how is this going to play out? Bearing in mind that these investigations do take a long, long time before they can get to the heart of the matter and to really get to what exactly is unfolding and all of the facts at hand. Nasreen Shaikh, Assalamu alaikum. Welcome to the program.
Wa alaikum assalam wa rahmatullahi. Very glad to hear you. Jazakallah khairan for having me.
Lovely to have you on the show. Just as a matter of interest, where are you based, Nasreen?
I'm based in Johannesburg.
Okay, my hometown as well. So, what do we what do we make of this situation? What is surprising or shocking is that it seems that all parties involved are accused of the same atrocities against each other.
What we find, unfortunately, in most situations where human rights abuse are rampant, if one has to take, for example, the situation that occurred in Bosnia-Herzegovina in the early 90s, we see very clearly that each faction was blaming the other. The Serbs were blaming the Croats for the very same abuses that they were accused of, and the Bosnians doing the very same thing with each other. This is often the case because each faction believes that they are indeed correct in their approach, and what they're doing is actually in the interest of their own agenda. And that is why we find them always saying to each other that you indeed are at fault, not me. When the Human Rights Commission decides, and the United Nations comes in, it's basically saying to you as a nation state that as a party to the United Nations Charter, you are obliged to undertake various forms, well, there are actually four, that are intrinsic to international human rights law. The respect for human rights, the fulfillment for human rights, the protection for human rights, as well as the promotion of human rights. When the state is seen to be erring on one of these four obligations, then you would find outside parties stepping in. And in this particular instance, what they're saying is that the United Nations are saying, hey, Mr. Shaikh, you're not doing anything about this. And seeing as you're keeping yourself completely neutral, or you are unwilling to do anything about it, then we as an international party will step in rather. And this is not unknown to us. This happens quite frequently all around the world. Especially when there are instances of near genocide or crimes against humanity, and especially that of rape that has been very, very seriously taken in the past few decades. You might recall that during World War I and World War II, rape was never considered to be a crime of war or a crime of genocide. But whilst I was at the United Nations, at the International Criminal Tribunal for the former Yugoslavia, I was based there for a period of time. We prosecuted and we decided at the ICTR, the International Criminal Tribunal for Rwanda, in one of their most famous hallmark cases was the Akayesu judgment. For those legal students who are out there and who want the full judgment, I'm sure they'll let you know, and I'll pass the information on to you. The crime of rape was then declared to be a crime of humanity and a crime of genocide, because if we recall what happened in Rwanda, there was an effort to annihilate one particular, the Hutus and the Tutsis were at war with each other. And one of them wanted to make sure that the other survived. So what they did was they used rape as a means of co-creating that particular faction and wiping out the other. So there was a very wonderful approach and a very robust approach taken by the courts, which was most welcome. The same thing we see when we look at Ethiopia. And we see that there is a fostering of a certain agenda. And when one has the goal in mind, one doesn't care how we dribble across the soccer field. We will dribble willy-nilly however we can, whether we play foul or not, becomes irrelevant in our minds. Human rights go out the door. This is welcome indeed that the United Nations has indeed stepped in. And you are correct as well in stating that these investigations do take a long while because they have to go to the heart of the matter and one has to collate information. When we have a field mission going out, that's what it's called, a field mission, the investigation itself. It rests on the 4 prongs that I explained to you a little while ago. To respect,
okay,
to ensure.
All right. So, Nasreen, obviously the Commission's mandate is for 1 year, but it would be renewable as and when necessary. That's the one point. Let's look at the issue. You've talked about war zones over time in recent history, obviously. You've spoken about the Croatian situation. You've spoken about the Houthi situation, and there's so many other situations all around the world. But in terms of when does the United Nations get the red flag to suggest that there are human rights atrocities or genocide going out in a particular conflict area, and they need to step in to assess the situation and then perhaps arbitrate or put a stop to it? How does that process unfold?
Well, we've got to think about the United Nations in terms of its, like in South Africa, we have a government in place and we've got the National Assembly and we have the provincial councils. At the United Nations, what we have is what's called the permanent members and we have the General Assembly. So the permanent members will be at the helm and they consist of countries, 5 countries. They are France, the UK, the US, Russia, and China. And they're dubbed colloquially the P5. They're the ones who actually make the final decision because they're the ones who hold the coffers to the United Nations. And without digressing and going into the political pragmatism as to why it is they do what they do, because you and I know we can talk about that for 1,500 days. It will go on forever. But the request would then arise generally from the General Assembly, which comprises of different parties, party states, I mean that vacillates throughout time. So they will hold office for a period of time and they would change over to other member states. Now, they would make recommendations, and that is their only power to make recommendations to the P5. And the P5 are the ones who hold the veto power and the final decision-making power. They decide what happens where and how it happens. So one has to understand that the entire decision making lies there. But in the instance of Ethiopia, in all likelihood, some human rights organizations on the African continent or observing from outside, be it the Americas, be it the Europe, or what have you, pointed a finger and said, something is going on here. There are actually red flags here, and we have to make sure we do something about it. And of course, what happens then is that, from what I understand, what happened with Ethiopia is that the European Union decided they would step in, and they began talking about Tigray itself specifically. Now, we must bear in mind that the EU delegates visited the Tigray region approximately 13 months ago. And now they realize that you need humanitarian assistance, and this is where the entire political pragmatism comes in. But one has to remember the location of Ethiopia. One has to remember the location of Bosnia and Herzegovina. When the refugees moved across the border into Macedonia, the first place that they came into was Netherlands, from Eastern Europe into Western Europe. And that is when the United Nations stood up and said, hey, we need to do something about this. Now, if we think about Ethiopia, where is Ethiopia located? Close to the Atlantic. Cross over the Atlantic into France. So somebody has to do something about this. And the propulsion probably came from France, within the EU, to say, guys, we have the Algerians crossing over. We have so much to deal with right now.
And that's a problem in itself already, with all the Northern African migrants getting into France, Italy, Greece, and trying to get to wherever they wanted to get to, possibly the UK. That's a different discussion on its own. Two final questions for you this morning. And I digress here, but please allow me a license to raise this issue, but I want a short answer to it. The United Nations, obviously are doing amazing work. Well, in this situation, we are talking about them trying to monitor situations of gross, atrocities. How come nothing's been done about the Palestinian situation up to now? Does it serve Western interests to leave the status quo as is there in Palestine?
Well, if you had to ask for a short answer, it would be a yes and a no. If you had to ask me for an abbreviated answer, I would say to you that one has to look at the coffers. I spoke about the UNT5 a short while ago. Which countries align the coffers of the United Nations? And you must understand what sustains the U.S. economy.
Right.
If one looks at that and one ties it back to the 1967 Golan Heights region, and what happened there, when Palestinians themselves took Israelites in, they took them to shelter as refugees when they fled from throughout Europe.
Right.
So one has to look at what happened there, and one has to be aware as to who lines the coffers and who spends the money, who holds that pen to the ATM card.
Yeah, I guess bottom line is in who, you're right, who's got the money, and they decide how, where, and with whom they spend the money. My final question here is, in a statement issued after the vote, the UN vote, obviously, regarding the human rights violations in Ethiopia, the Ethiopian government has denounced the resolution as being politically motivated. It's also gone on to accuse the Council of double standards, of meddling in the internal affairs of a sovereign state under the pretext of human rights, and has gone on to say that it won't cooperate with the established mechanisms imposed upon it against its consent. Your thoughts?
We've got to keep in mind that the vote rally was quite a narrow one. It was supported by 21 countries and 15 countries abstained, and 15 against, with 11 abstaining. So quite a close tie in terms of thinking patterns and understanding what happened there. One has to be aware of that, firstly. Secondly, one has to also understand that when it comes to the abstaining states, they're saying either which way, we're not so sure as to what you're doing. And we might be able to sway one way or the other. So we're going to reserve what it is that we have in place. And when we look at the situation itself, Ms. Al-Nashif, she urged the government of Ethiopia to deliver fair and independent proceedings of the violations that had been identified. But unfortunately, nothing really happened. And that's when human rights violations come to they reach a certain height, like they did in our own country, then a state can no longer claim that I am the head of this household. And you can't come in here and tell me how to do my family as I am doing. That's the concept of sovereignty, basically. State sovereignty.
Okay, unfortunately, we're going to have to leave it there. It's been wonderful talking to you. Undoubtedly, we're going to have lots more conversations in the future. I do look forward to that. Thank you for your time and have yourself a great day.
Inshallah, you as well.
Okay, keep safe. 9:33 exactly, and that was Advocate Nasreen Shaikh. She's an international human rights lawyer talking to us about the human rights violations in Ethiopia. In a minute or two, we'll be joined by Hanif Hendricks, leader of the Al Jamaa Party, and we'll be wrapping up by talking with Aisha Dadi Patel about the article she's written, which has appeared in in a world-renowned tabloid. So all of that and more coming up. Stay with us right here on Salam Media.
These days, I'm more